No one in medieval times aspired to be an assassin. It wasn't a career choice. It was the final destination for a life gone terribly wrong. The majority weren't mysterious figures trained in secret mountain temples. While some assassins did have those skills, most did not. No one becomes an assassin by choice, at least not in medieval Europe. After all, stabbing someone to death is a skill in itself. An assassin could be hired, payment made, and then they could just as easily run away and hide instead of doing the job. Or perhaps they would find a way to extort the person whose life was bought, demanding more money to stay silent about what they knew. Potential assassins were often warned about the dangers of the job by other criminals in the hopes of dissuading them. More commonly, the assassin was only paid when they brought proof of their victim's death. This proof could be a lock of hair from the corpse, a ring or other item taken from the finger of the dead, or even a small piece of the corpse itself. The reality of medieval assassination was rarely so glamorous. Assassins were generally not highly trained killers, but desperate people with few other options. Their targets were often corrupt officials or hated nobles, but they were also sometimes innocent people who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. While medieval assassins were certainly a part of history, they were not the shadowy figures we imagine them to be today. Instead, they were regular people who resorted to extreme measures to survive. While this practice made sense in that it proved that the assassin actually carried out the murder, it also left them in a difficult position. After all, they were now carrying around evidence that could be used to link them to the crime. If caught, this evidence could result in a brutal trial and conviction. So assassins often destroyed what they could and hid the rest. Of course, destroying evidence left behind after the assassination also made it harder for the client to prove that the hit had been carried out, meaning they might have to wait longer for their payment. Assassins often had to deal with dogs, which could alert guards to their presence or worse, attack them. They also risked discovery by the target's friends or family, who would not take kindly to seeing someone sneak around their home late at night. Finally, there was always the chance that the assassination attempt failed, leaving the assassin in a precarious situation. Because of these risks, many assassins preferred to take on multiple contracts at once, increasing their chances of success, and giving them more options if one of the targets found out what was going on and tried to stop them. These assassins differed from their secular counterparts in that they were usually not motivated by the promise of coin. Instead, they were driven by a desire to eliminate heresy or punish sinners. They also did not typically receive payment upon completion of the job, since they were already employed by the church. While these holy assassins were often given extra compensation, the motivation for the job was spiritual rather than financial. Unfortunately, these spiritual assassins were not always as above worldly concerns as their vows might suggest. One infamous set of spiritual assassins were the assassins of the Catholic Church's Albigensian Crusade. During the 13th century, the Church sought to crush the Cathar movement, a religious sect that had grown popular in southern France. Dubbed the Heretic Bane, these men and women traveled the countryside killing suspected Cathars. While their intentions were pure, the Heretic Bane had no qualms about torturing suspects to force confessions or killing entire villages if even a single heretic lived there. The Albigensian Crusade went on for over a decade, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. These holy killers were about as extreme a case as possible. For the most part, however, even secular assassins were unlikely to be motivated by anything other than money. After all, why risk your life to kill someone who has done nothing to you personally? And the best assassins were also good at climbing, sneaking around and getting away quickly and quietly. However, there was no formal training involved. Medieval battles were loud, messy affairs with dozens or even hundreds of combatants clashing openly in the name of everyone to see. To be an assassin, a much quieter approach was necessary. Sometimes a noble would hire a group of mercenaries to take someone out. Mercenaries were generally trained fighters, but they operated best in groups and open battle rather than alone in the shadows. For that reason, a mercenary might have trouble adapting to the stealth and quick thinking required of an assassin. The skills required of an assassin are not the same ones required of a fighter. Fighters need strength, stamina, sword skills, and endurance. Assassins needed patience, cunning, and careful planning skills. Moreover, assassins needed to learn new ways of fighting, usually with smaller, quieter weapons. To succeed as an assassin, a person needed to overcome their background and learn an entirely different way of operating. Someone looking to hire an assassin would normally turn to a criminal underworld contact who would put them in touch with someone willing to do the deed. Once the deed was done, the assassin then received payment, presumably with enough money left over to disappear and start a new life somewhere else. That's the theory anyway. When we think of famous assassins like the legendary killer of Julius Caesar, Brutus, or famous fictional characters like Ezio Auditore from Assassin's Creed, we imagine well-trained professionals who take out high-profile targets with elaborate stealth and precision. These ideas of the modern era have trickled down to our conceptions of medieval assassins as well. However, the reality was far more pedestrian. They were desperate peasants, disgraced soldiers, or former thieves with a steady-hand individuals so far off the social radar that their crimes went unnoticed. If you were a person of means, you didn't become an assassin. You hired one. But if you were fresh out of debtor's prison and known for solving problems quietly, a coin purse and a whispered name were likely in your future. And the names you were given weren't those of simple farmers. They were corrupt barons, wealthy bishops, or nobles surrounded by a dozen bodyguards in a moat. The pay was tempting, but the job was horrifying. By the time someone took such a contract, they had nothing left to lose: no family, no future, and certainly no dental plan. You may think that being a medieval assassin required skills honed over years of practice, like parkour, martial arts, or sneaking around without setting off the motion sensor on the security system. In medieval Europe, assassins were mostly commoners who came from the lowest rungs of society, people who had little to lose by taking dangerous jobs. Many were outcasts such as criminals, beggars, or people recently released from prison. The best way to understand medieval assassins is to consider them a kind of extreme handyman. When someone needed something done discreetly and permanently, they turned to an assassin. In other words, to become an assassin, all you really needed was a willingness to take the job and stay quiet about it afterwards. While medieval assassins were usually men, women occasionally took to the profession as well, particularly in cases where the target was another woman. Training by not dying. Now, of course, this isn't to say that medieval assassins were completely untrained. In reality, paying someone to murder another person was illegal, dangerous, and very risky. For potential assassins, a military background sometimes helped because it provided useful skills. However, even a soldier's training did not necessarily make them successful assassins. The unreliable promise of coin assassination was not easy work. In fact, it was quite risky. As we've already mentioned, some assassins were given half or even all of their payment up front, but this was rare. While most assassins were commoners, a few were part of religious orders. When you think of an assassin, you probably imagine someone skulking around a nobleman's bedroom in the middle of the night, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Now check out what does it actually mean to die. Or watch how deadly were medieval catapults? Really? Becoming an assassin. No need for fancy hand gestures, lots of yelling, and some mild stalking. Becoming an assassin was simple. All you needed were some basic skills that anyone could learn with a bit of practice. Forget the fantasy novels with their retractable wrist blades and enchanted daggers. And this is where things got complicated because assassins weren't hired for easy jobs. Servants and staff were a danger. One wrong look and they'd alert the guards. And let us not forget about those annoying civilians who always seemed to wander through at the worst possible time. In the world of medieval assassins, being good at your job meant knowing how to get close to your target without raising any suspicion. That's why disguise and deception were essential tools of the assassin's trade. And hey, don't forget to show us some love by clicking that thumbs up button. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Most assassins weren't known for their looks, so disguises were a must. They needed to blend in and appear unassuming, whether that meant dressing as a peasant, a merchant, or even a member of the clergy. It all depended on the situation. Sometimes being inconspicuous was enough. Other times, assassins went all out with elaborate disguises, complete with fake beards and glasses. Seriously, it was like they were trying to be unrecognizable. But it wasn't just about what you wore. It was also about how you carried yourself. A good assassin knew how to act, how to speak, and even how to walk in order to avoid drawing attention to themselves. They learned how to imitate different social classes and professions, allowing them to slip into different situations without anyone suspecting a thing. And let's not forget about the art of eavesdropping. Assassins needed to know how to listen in on conversations without being detected. They'd hang around taverns and marketplaces, listening to rumors and gathering information about their targets. They followed people, observing their habits and routines, learning everything they could about them. Honestly, it was like being a real-life ninja. But even with all these skills, being an assassin was still a risky business. They were constantly on the lookout for danger, ready to flee at the first sign of trouble. They never let their guard down, not even for a second. Being a master of disguise and deception meant being prepared for anything. And your target was likely paranoid? I mean, if someone was willing to hire an assassin, he or she should expect nothing less. Listen up, folks. Being an assassin was a dangerous, unpredictable profession, but it didn't require any special talent. Anyone could become an assassin, provided they had the stomach for it. In fact, being a loner was a plus. You didn't need fancy hand gestures, lots of yelling, and some mild stalking. But don't be fooled. This wasn't for the faint of heart. Sure, you could become an assassin, but would you survive the job? They'd probably have food tasters and sleeping in different rooms each night. So, getting close could take weeks of posing as a servant, bribing a chambermaid, or hiding in a barrel, literally. And once you finally got within striking distance, you had one shot to get it right. No second chances. The pressure was immense, but it was part of the job. If you couldn't handle it, you shouldn't be an assassin. Let's face it, if someone was willing to hire an assassin, they wanted that person dead for a reason. They probably deserved it. And if killing them was easy, they wouldn't have hired an assassin in the first place. You see, the best assassins were hired by wealthy clients who wanted to get rid of equally wealthy targets. People like nobles, bishops, and military leaders, people who had a lot of money and a lot of enemies. These folks were notorious for being difficult to kill. They had dozens of armed and well-fed guards, loyal servants and allies who'd be suspicious of anyone who came too close. Oh, and they usually lived inside castles. Now, castles were designed to keep people in and, more importantly, to keep people out. Getting close to your target would require navigating a maze of corridors, dodging servants and enduring endless inspections from guards. Not to mention the castle walls, moats, and the ever-present threat of boiling oil. Yes, boiling oil was a thing back then. An assassin's toolkit was comprised of whatever could be stolen, sharpened, or hidden under a cloak without making a sound. Some assassins got by with cheap, dull tools, while others used expensive, well-crafted weapons. Back in medieval times, they were as common as rat poison today. People used them for everything from settling business deals to eliminating rivals. But remember, this isn't a fantasy novel. Poisons weren't magical elixirs that could kill you instantly. Most were made from plants, minerals, or other natural substances, and let's face it, toad guts. Toad guts, they weren't exactly reliable. Some poisons took hours to kick in, giving your target time to seek help. Others were so slow acting that you might as well have just waited for the target to die of old age. Then there were the chronic poisons, substances that caused illness or disability. For instance, chronic poisoning could cause paralysis, making it easier to dispose of your victim later. However, these substances took months to work and left traces behind, potentially implicating you. Basically, your choice of poison depended on your skills, your target, and the environment. But remember, assassins weren't known for their chemical knowledge. Poisons were risky, unpredictable, and sometimes downright dangerous to use. So most assassins preferred the reliability of a good old-fashioned blade. That's why the best assassins were often known as stealthy stalkers. They preferred to strike quickly and silently, eliminating their targets before anyone knew what hit them. Honestly, anything goes. If you were lucky, you had a decent dagger, sharp and rust-free, and you knew how to use it. Poison existed, but it was unpredictable, made from plants, minerals, or toad guts. A little too much and you might accidentally poison yourself. Too little and your target would just get a stomachache and become more suspicious. Of course, if you failed to kill your target, you better have a backup plan. Throwing knives were useful for dispatching someone from a distance or leaving quietly. But even they could be overkill. After all, a silenced dagger could be quieter than a mouse squeak. Bows and arrows were also popular since they allowed you to stay far away from the target, but they did require some skill. Plus, why risk alerting the guards by making noise? Stealth was key, and the less noise you made, the better. Your weapons were your only companions, and you prayed they wouldn't fail you at a critical moment. It wasn't like blacksmithing, which required a hot forge, rare materials, and years of experience. Being an assassin was a job for loners, people who didn't mind the dark and lonely nights spent waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. This wasn't for those looking to get rich. In fact, most assassins barely earned enough to pay for their own board and lodging, but it didn't require any special talent either. Just some willingness to do the dirty work when no one else could. Now let's start with the basics. We have gear, stealing, sharpening, and hiding. The impossible target. Now that you had the tools to do the job, it was time to find your target. Even once you got inside, your target was still very much protected. Next, choosing your poison. Let's talk about poisons now. Poisons were a favorite tool of assassins, your tools of the trade, disguise, and deception. And what's the most important lesson we've learned today? Have you ever considered becoming an assassin? Are you good at sneaking around? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. We now live in a world of superpowered beings who can change the course of the fate of entire nations at a whim. Yet despite all of the fancy costumes worn by these heroes and villains alike, there is something that many of them just don't quite get right when it comes to portraying a deadly killer. To survive in this profession, you had to master several skills, both physical and mental. These skills weren't acquired overnight. It took years of training to become a master assassin, and even then, it was a constant struggle to stay ahead of the competition. The reality was closer to a sickly goat herder trying to look inconspicuous. Disguise was whatever you could scavenge: peasant rags, an oversized monk's robe, or a guard's uniform that still smelled of its previous owner. They knew that there were risks involved in their profession and planned accordingly. For example, if a poison was the chosen weapon, an assassin would always have a backup method of dispatching their target, such as a knife or a garrote. But the reality of medieval assassins was far more grounded. For starters, they didn't have fancy gadgets or high-tech weapons. Their tools of the trade were often simple and easily concealed items like knives, daggers, and poisons. Waiting for the right moment to strike was crucial to the success of any assassination. Assassins had to be able to remain hidden and undetected for long periods of time, often observing their target and waiting for an opportune moment to strike. This required discipline, focus, and a willingness to bide their time. Remember, being an assassin was not just a job, it was a way of life. It took years of training and skill to become a master assassin, and even then, it was a constant struggle to stay ahead of the competition. So next time you find yourself playing an assassin in a game, movie, or book, keep these tips in mind and do it right. Assassins who lacked patience were not only more likely to be detected, but they also risked making mistakes that could jeopardize their mission. Assassins had to be able to move quickly and quietly, so they typically avoided carrying heavy loads or making a lot of noise. Assassins had to be able to think several steps ahead and anticipate their target's reactions. They also had to be able to maintain their cover and avoid detection even when faced with suspicion or scrutiny. Cunning was also important when it came to escaping after an assassination. Assassins had to be able to blend in with the crowd and avoid being identified. They also had to be prepared to flee quickly and efficiently, avoiding any confrontation with authorities. This meant leaving most of their belongings behind and being prepared to travel on foot. Whether it was forging documents, assuming a false identity, or spreading misinformation, assassins had to be adept at lying and deception. This was especially important when planning an assassination, as assassins often had to gather information about their target's habits and routines without being detected. Assassins also had to be careful about the information they revealed about themselves to others. They had to be able to maintain their cover and avoid revealing any details that could compromise their mission. Deception was a useful tool for assassins, allowing them to gather information, evade detection, and successfully complete their missions. They also had to be careful about the way they interacted with others. Making a lot of noise or drawing attention to themselves could tip off their enemies and put their lives at risk. This ensured that the assassination would be successful regardless of any unforeseen circumstances that might interfere. Assassins had to pay attention to everything from their target's daily routine to the layout of their home or workplace. This allowed them to identify vulnerabilities and develop a plan that was as foolproof as possible. For example, an assassin might choose to target their victim at a specific time of day when they were most vulnerable, or use a specific entrance to avoid detection. By paying attention to every little detail, assassins were able to increase their chances of success and minimize the risk of being caught. Additionally, assassins would often have a plan B in place in case their cover was blown or their escape route was compromised. Assassins had to be able to adapt and improvise when necessary. For example, if an assassin's weapon was discovered before they could use it, they had to be prepared to come up with a new plan on the fly. This required creativity, quick thinking, and a knowledge of their surroundings. Additionally, assassins had to be aware of their target's reactions and adjust their plans accordingly. Targets might be more or less guarded than expected, or might change their routines without warning. Assassins had to be flexible and ready to adapt to any situation. This could involve having false documents ready to go or knowing a safe house where they could lay low. By always having a backup plan, assassins were able to minimize risks and maximize their chances of success. The goal was to blend in, which meant looking as dirty, tired, and malnourished as everyone else. A mask would only make you look like a leper, and wigs didn't exist. Your disguise might buy you 5 minutes of confusion, but after that you had to be gone. It was a high-risk, high-reward profession, and those who succeeded were often legends in their own time. There were no guilds, no sidekicks, and no handlers offering encouragement. Every contact was a risk, and every friend was a potential liability. To infiltrate these heavily guarded areas, assassins would study their target's routine and habits meticulously. By understanding their target's daily activities, they could identify vulnerabilities and develop a plan to exploit them. Once an assassin had infiltrated the target's location, they needed to be prepared to flee quickly. This meant having a thorough knowledge of the area and being able to move swiftly and silently through the shadows. Assassins would often use disguises to help them blend in and avoid detection. By studying the target's routine and having a plan in place for escaping quickly, assassins could increase their chances of disappearing undetected. You couldn't settle down or afford to be recognized. Even other criminals kept their distance. You were the person who made people disappear, and no one wanted to share a drink with someone who could attract a mob with torches. You sat in the darkest corner of the inn, your back to the wall, and never stayed in one place for more than a night. If you want to play an assassin well, you need to keep a few things in mind. First, assassins are often loners by necessity. They can't afford to trust anyone, not even each other. Second, assassins are patient. They wait for the perfect moment to strike, and they plan their attacks carefully. Impulsivity is the enemy of the assassin. Third, assassins are masters of disguise. They can blend into any crowd and make themselves virtually invisible. Fourth, assassins are experts at what they do. They are lethal with their weapons of choice, and they know how to use their environment to their advantage. Finally, assassins are motivated by money, power, or revenge. They are not in it for the fun of it. They have a job to do, and they will stop at nothing to get it done. It's not enough to simply have cool armor, weapons, or gadgets if you want to do a good job playing the role of an assassin. That's why we've put together this list of things that assassins actually did in the Middle Ages, so that the next time you play one in a game, movie, or book, you can do it right. Things to keep in mind before you begin. Being an assassin wasn't just a job, it was a way of life. Now that we've established that being an assassin in the Middle Ages required a lot of skill and preparation, let's take a look at some of the things that assassins actually did during this time period. We will explore their techniques, their mindset, and the tools they used to make sure they got the job done right. So sit back, grab a drink, and get ready to learn what it really meant to be an assassin in the Middle Ages. 1. the art of blending. And when you picture a medieval assassin, you might imagine sleek black robes and a mysterious hood. 2. A life of isolation in the world of medieval assassins. You were utterly alone. 3. Always have a backup plan. Medieval assassins were not only skilled fighters and poisoners, but also cunning strategists. 4. Be prepared to run away. Assassins were often hired to eliminate high-profile targets who were heavily guarded. 5. Travel light. The Assassin's Creed series is known for its sleek, agile characters that scale buildings and fight off hordes of enemies with ease. 6. Pay attention to detail while planning an assassination. Every little detail mattered. 7. Adapt and improvise. Plans didn't always go according to plan. 8. Patience is paramount. Perhaps the most important quality for an assassin to have was patience. 9. The cunning assassins often had to deceive their targets or their targets' associates. This required a high level of cunning and intelligence. 10. Master the art of deception. The art of deception was another essential skill for medieval assassins. By following these tips, you can ensure that you portray an assassin in a way that is not only believable, but also respectful to the historical reality of these fascinating figures. In the dark, dank basement of a water-deep tavern, a hulking brute with an elven cloak draped over his muscular frame slammed his mug onto the table. The ale sloshed over the rim and spilled down his massive biceps. Around him, fellow patrons watched intently, their faces illuminated by the flickering candlelight dancing over the walls. "So let me get this straight," drawled a sharp-eyed human woman from a corner table. "We got ourselves a heretic in our midst, eh? Would you have us sit idly by while our city burns and our people die?" Another patron, a dwarf with a thick beard and a battle-hardened face, slammed his mug down in agreement. "Speak up, Elspeth. Tell us what you know. Why don't we start again at the beginning? What exactly has happened? A rebel who thinks he can take on the Citadel and its judges? And I believe I have some insight into this matter. To start, could someone please fill me in on the details of this so-called attack?" The big man grunted, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Call me a friend, a fellow concerned citizen who wants nothing more than to see Waterdeep thrive. That's all. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe it's time we took action." Street vendors hawked their wares, musicians played lively tunes, and the murmur of conversation floated on the breeze. His keen eyes missed nothing, taking in every detail of the bustling marketplace. His ears, attuned to the subtlest of noises, strained to catch any whisper that might offer a clue. But Erethan paid no heed to the sights and sounds around him. His mind was already racing, plotting his next move in the intricate game of intrigue and deception. And as the story unfolded, Ardeth listened intently, occasionally interjecting with a pertinent question or insightful comment. By the time the tale was finished, a plan was already forming in his mind. In the shadowy realm where secrets whispered and danger lurked around every corner, he was in his element. The city, with its labyrinthine streets and hidden alleys, was his playground. And he, the master of disguise and deception, was ready to weave his web. This rogue was clearly intelligent, perhaps even cunning. But could he really help them? Or was he just another self-serving mercenary interested only in lining his own pockets? "Don't play coy, Elspeth. Everyone here knows why we've gathered. This is a matter for the Citadel and its trained agents. You and your precious order have made many enemies in your time." He adjusted his cloak, revealing a hint of polished steel beneath. Then, with a final enigmatic smile, he turned and strode confidently toward the door. But as the tension in the room reached a fever pitch, a new voice cut through the noise. It was smooth and confident, cutting through the undercurrent of menace like a knife through warm butter. "Someone in this room knows who's behind this attack, and I want names, I want faces, and most importantly, I want answers." Elspeth remained seated, her gaze unwavering. "As I said before, brute force will not solve anything. And what if they find out that the person responsible is sitting right here in this tavern?" Elspeth sighed, knowing she wouldn't get the answers she sought tonight. "Perhaps I can help you, my friends. Perhaps there's more here than meets the eye." All eyes turned to the newcomer. Who was this rogue who dared interrupt the conversation? And what did he know? With a slight smile, the newcomer gracefully took a seat between the dwarf and the cloaked figure. His casual demeanor did little to hide the glint of steel flashing at his hips or the dangerous aura that seemed to emanate from his very pores. He was a rogue, no doubt about it, but his confidence and quick wit had already made him an intriguing presence in the room. "My name is Arathan," he began, his voice like velvet and steel. The newcomer gestured with a flourish, indicating for the others to go on. The hulking brute leaned forward, his voice a low growl. "Who are you really? What game are you playing?" Arathan simply smiled, a flash of white teeth in the candlelight. With that, Arathan stood, his movements fluid and graceful despite his bulk. Outside, the night was alive with the sounds of the city. He had seen enough of these grand cities to know that power resided not in the hands of the obvious, but often in the shadows. For Arathan, this was more than just a game. It was a test of skill, a challenge to be the best. As a hitman, the hardest part of the job was not pulling the trigger. That's what the movies get wrong about being an assassin. It was then some twitchy finger on a violent rampage that got me sent to prison for 25 years. Easy money. I knew the target's routine. He walked the same streets every day after work, always alone, always on time. I staked out his route and I waited. When he appeared, I followed him, then I struck. His real name was never important. The shadows applauded my handiwork, but they weren't going to pay me, not because I did a bad job, quite the opposite. Don't stick around to see how they spin it in the news. I ditched the car and I hit the road, no map, no plan, just driving. Until I ran out of gas, then I started walking. What I didn't count on was the terrain. I'd never worked in the mountains before. Neither had I ever hiked with a backpack full of cash. But I did what I had to do. Ghosts don't do deals. Don't stick around to read the congratulatory message in the paper. When it was dark, I came out. I kept moving until I reached a highway. I thumbed a ride and hitchhiked all the way across the country. I slept in cheap motels under assumed names. I changed my appearance, I grew a beard, I wore disguises. I was clean, or so I thought. The target might be dead, but now everyone wants you. They'd seen me in a diner or in a bar. I left town again. This time I headed south. The heat death of the universe was closer than I realized. I picked up a hitchhiker and I drove her to a ranch outside of Las Vegas. I got busted trying to cross the border into Mexico. The feds do because they want to make an example of you. The mob does because you made them look weak. Your client does because you know too much. The best laid plans of mice and men go awry. Sometimes the target survives. Sometimes there are witnesses. Sometimes you get sloppy. And sometimes, just sometimes, you get lucky. They paid only when the deed was done and I was gone, disappeared into the ether. And I hadn't disappeared. Not this time. One clean shot from my .45 silenced pistol and he hit the pavement. No witnesses, no problems. Or so I thought. It was the aftermath. Specifically, it was my inability to disappear that landed me in deep water. I spent 5 years in solitary confinement waiting for trial. 5 years without seeing daylight. Then a miracle happened. The feds offered me a deal. They wanted me to testify against my clients, the mob and the Russian mafia. In exchange, they said I'd serve no more time. They had a description of my car, a composite sketch of my face, and they were offering a reward for any information leading to my capture. My client called me up. I knew what he wanted without him even saying it. Because the minute you cross someone, you become a liability. You know too much, you saw too much. You can place faces and names to the voices on the other end of the line. You know who ordered what and when. And in this business, you either take the secret to your grave or you get killed. He wanted to know if I'd slipped up, if I'd been seen. I told him I played it cool, followed protocol. I was certain I was clean. But then again, I always thought I was clean. That's what made me good at this. That made me dangerous. See, the gig was this. Rub out a low lobster named Frankie, who had turned informant for the feds. By the time I got back to my hotel room, the news was everywhere. The police had shut down the entire city. He thanked me and said we'd talk soon. That meant never. My client was a ghost. And here's the thing, being a ghost doesn't mean you don't have enemies. In fact, it means you have the most enemies. So you succeeded. The dagger found its mark. The target is dead. Congratulations. Now run for your life. What I got lucky at was escaping the city before the dragnet closed in. Then I heard voices. I stopped dead in my tracks. I found a cave and I hid in it. Because eventually the calls started coming in again. Someone had recognized me. When they searched the car, they found the suitcase full of cash. Sitting in that courtroom, watching the old life drain away, I understood why people became informants. There was no other way out. But the feds forgot one thing. Medieval Europe was a dangerous place to be alive, especially if you were an assassin. These shadowy figures stalked the night, taking out high-value targets with deadly efficiency. But people weren't just afraid of them, they were also cursed. These men and women operated in the shadows, carrying out hits with precision and disappearing before anyone knew what happened. But during the Middle Ages, when people had no understanding of poison or firearms, the methods assassins used to carry out their contracts were more akin to magic. No, really. Commoners believed assassins could shift into animals, conjure up hellish beasts, and even make deals with the devil himself. It was common for people to blame Satan and his minions for any unexplained event, from crop failures to illnesses to sudden infant deaths. They were often encouraged by the very people who hired assassins. By portraying their enemies as cursed, they tried to scare potential witnesses and victims away, giving the assassins an advantage. Of course, it didn't always work. Sometimes people didn't believe the rumors and met their end because of it. A few years later, she was executed for the murder of her husband. But that's a story for another time. And the characters start talking about witches and werewolves. Remember that these superstitions didn't just add atmosphere to the story. They were based on real fears and beliefs that people had. Superstitions were more than just folklore. They were a way for people to cope with a world that was often cruel, unpredictable, and downright scary. And nowhere was this more true than when an assassin was on the loose. Other times, those accused of being cursed fought back against their accusers, pointing out that if they were truly cursed, why would God allow them to be harmed? So it was only natural that they would come to that conclusion when faced with the work of an assassin. After all, what better way to explain these seemingly supernatural killings than by invoking the ultimate evil, the devil himself? He was the founder of the Nizari branch of Ismailism, a Shia Muslim sect. And he took his enemies out with a poison called shaitan, which was so deadly it was said to kill with a touch. She was the daughter of a wealthy merchant and the niece of King Henry II, and she was known for her beauty, intelligence, and wit. But these qualities didn't win her many friends in the royal court. You see, Rebecca had a sharp tongue and wasn't afraid to use it. She made enemies of some very powerful people, including the royal family. When someone important bit the big one, people immediately suspected the assassin's involvement, but they couldn't prove it. You see, Henry had been on trial for murdering 4 knights after mistaking them for thieves. And Rebecca had spoken up in defense of her brother, who was one of the knights. Could her curse have caused the king's heart attack? Some people believe so. But Rebecca fought back against her detractors, saying that if she were a witch, why would she need to curse the king when he was already on trial for murder? She also pointed out that she had never seen the devil, even though he was supposedly her father's business partner. With her sharp tongue and quick wit, Rebecca managed to escape the accusations of witchcraft. Since assassins relied on poisons, knives, and crossbows, there was little physical evidence left behind. And that's what made these mysterious deaths so terrifying. People couldn't understand how their leaders and fellow villagers were being taken out. So they came up with a simple explanation: assassins were cursed. Let's find out why. Assassins are synonymous with danger, secrecy, and skill. Take, for example, the man considered to be the father of modern assassination, Hassan al-Sabah. And that curse wasn't limited to the victim. The belief was that anyone involved in an assassination was cursed, including the assassin's family members, friends, and even employers. You see, the common folk had no idea how assassins managed to kill without leaving a trace. So they created an entire mythology around these mysterious deaths. They believed assassins could take the form of wild animals, specifically wolves, since wolves often hunted in groups just like assassins. They also believed assassins could summon hellish hounds that looked like giant wolves with flaming eyes, dripping fangs, and leathery wings. These demonic canines were said to tear apart the victim's soul as they approached, causing them to die of fright. Talk about a nightmare fuel. But perhaps the most terrifying belief was that assassins made deals with the devil himself. These superstitions didn't just pop up out of nowhere. One of the most famous examples of this is the story of Lady Rebecca, who lived in 12th century England. When her uncle King Henry died suddenly, rumors began to circulate that Rebecca had cursed him. Sadly, she wouldn't escape the clutches of fate. So the next time you watch a period drama set in medieval Europe,